Build Generational Wealth, Strategies to Secure Your Family's Future. Written by Ronnie Rowland. Published by Growth Literacy Lounge. In 1972, two men, both in their early 30s, opened barbershops just 10 miles apart in northern Georgia. They charged the same prices, saw the same number of customers, and worked 6 days a week for over 30 years. But when they retired, the difference between them was staggering. One sold his shop, paid off his modest debts, and moved in with his daughter. The other passed down 3 properties, a small investment portfolio, and a handwritten guide titled What I Want You to Know About Money. His grandchildren still use it today. They earned the same. But they passed down something very different. This book is not about how to make fast money. It is not about stock picks, trending side hustles, or secret tax loopholes. It is about something quieter and more powerful: how families create wealth that lasts. Not wealth that flickers for a decade, but wealth that shapes generations. The families who achieve this don't have more luck. They have more clarity. They make decisions differently. They think in centuries, not years. They talk about money early. They plan for problems before they arrive. And most importantly, they treat wealth not as a destination, but as a responsibility. This isn't a financial playbook. It's a framework. A pattern of behavior that repeats itself, quietly, inside the world's most resilient legacies. Because the difference between what is earned and what is passed down isn't found in the numbers. It's found in the story. Chapter 1: The Legacy Test. In the quiet suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, 2 families lived just 4 blocks apart. The Parkers and the Colemans both purchased their homes in the early 1970s. Each household earned roughly the same income, modest but comfortable. Both families raised children under similar conditions, drove similar cars, and attended the same school district. Yet, 50 years later, the Parker family owns 3 properties, runs a family business, and is preparing to launch a scholarship fund in their name. The Colemans, on the other hand, are scattered, burdened with debt, and embroiled in a legal dispute over their late father's modest estate. How did 2 nearly identical families experience such divergent outcomes? This question is at the heart of the legacy test, a quiet, often invisible examination that unfolds across generations. It has little to do with how much money is made and everything to do with how money is handled, preserved, and passed on. Wealth, after all, is not a snapshot, it is a storyline. The assumption that financial success in one generation guarantees success in the next is deeply flawed. In fact, research shows that 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the second generation, and 90% by the third. The tragedy isn't the loss of wealth, it's the failure to establish a system of continuity. Like a baton dropped in a relay race, generational wealth can disappear not through malice, but through missteps, miscommunication, and missed opportunities. What separated the Parkers from the Colemans wasn't a single decision, but a string of quiet practices, habits, mindsets, and strategies that over time crystallized into culture. The Parkers held quarterly family finance meetings, even when the children were young. A ledger was kept with handwritten notes from the grandparents, reminding the family not just how much they owned, but why they owned it. When their oldest son started his first summer job, he was required to split his earnings into 3 envelopes. 1 for spending, 1 for saving, and 1 for giving. These were not merely budgeting tactics, they were rituals. The Colemans, by contrast, believed in discretion. Finances were kept private, even secretive. There was a sense of respect for hard work but no shared vision for wealth. When the family patriarch passed away, his will was vague, his accounts scattered, and his children unsure of how to proceed. Years of effort, stored in assets and savings, evaporated in probate costs, legal battles, and misunderstandings. It is tempting to think of wealth as static, something acquired once and kept forever. But wealth, like language or tradition, is dynamic. It must be taught, shared, and adapted. Families who pass the legacy test recognize this. They understand that money, unmanaged, is like a river without banks, prone to overflow, erosion, or stagnation. Curiously, it's often not the wealthy who succeed in this. Some of the most durable generational wealth structures can be found in families of modest means who learn how to steward resources with discipline and intention. In rural Alabama, for instance, a family of farmers with little formal education passed down land for 6 generations, not because of legal acumen, but because of communal trust and clear expectations. There was no estate attorney, only a handwritten document, signed and sealed at the church. These stories reveal a pattern. The legacy test is not a matter of income, but of clarity. It's not determined by earnings, but by foresight. And most importantly, it is not won by individuals, but by families who see themselves as part of something bigger, an enterprise with both a mission and a memory. The true measure of wealth, then, is not how much is owned in a single lifetime. It is whether what was built can outlive its builder. That is the essence of generational wealth. That is the legacy test. Chapter 2: The $1,000 Principle. In 2005, a quiet man named Ronald Reed passed away in Brattleboro, Vermont. He had worked most of his life as a janitor and gas station attendant. He wore flannel shirts, drove an old used car, and never made more than a modest income. So when it was revealed that he had amassed over $8 million in investments, the public response was disbelief. How could someone with such an ordinary job leave behind a fortune that rivaled that of seasoned entrepreneurs? The answer lay not in a sudden windfall, a lottery win, or a risky business venture. It lay in an approach so mundane it was nearly invisible: consistency. Reed lived by a principle that is frequently overlooked in a culture obsessed with big breaks and overnight success: the compounding power of small, disciplined decisions. This idea, the $1,000 principle, suggests that wealth is not built in bold strokes, but in careful repetitions. It is not the lottery ticket that changes a life, but the quiet act of investing $1,000 again and again, month after month, year after year. Not just monetarily, but behaviorally. Patterns create outcomes. Contrast Reed's story with that of John McAfee, the software pioneer who once held a fortune north of $100 million. Lavish homes, exotic cars, and high-stakes investments were the norm. But within a few years, most of it was gone. There were no constraints, no rituals, and no system, only expansion. Where Red planted and watered, McAfee chased and consumed. The real lesson here isn't about moral superiority. It's about structure. The $1,000 principle doesn't rely on brilliance or charisma. It doesn't require luck. What it does require is clarity. It asks a question that seems deceptively simple: what would happen if one small action were repeated relentlessly for 30 years? To understand its impact, consider the mathematics of compounding. A $1,000 investment, placed annually in a simple index fund earning an average of 7% per year, becomes nearly $100,000 in 30 years. Now stretch that same discipline across multiple decisions: saving, reducing debt, avoiding high-interest loans, and making informed career moves, and a different trajectory begins to take shape. But the $1,000 principle isn't just financial. It operates in education, in health, in relationships. The child who reads 20 minutes a day will, by high school, have read millions of words more than the child who doesn't. The family that discusses money every Sunday evening will, by adulthood, have developed a shared language of financial confidence. The world tends to spotlight what is rare: lottery winners, celebrity entrepreneurs, viral successes. But what is common, what is practiced daily in quiet corners of the world, is often more powerful. The $1,000 principle rests on this overlooked truth: wealth is not the result of scale, but of rhythm. This idea challenges the narrative that success must be explosive. It reframes wealth as a process, not a prize. And it calls into question the notion that financial freedom is reserved for those with high incomes or elite credentials. In truth, the families who pass down wealth often begin not with abundance, but with intention. In Jackson, Mississippi, a retired teacher named Gloria Evans used this principle to guide her 5 grandchildren. Each year, for their birthdays, she contributed $1,000 to custodial accounts. She accompanied each deposit with a lesson on inflation, interest, or budgeting. When the eldest grandchild turned 25, he had $40,000 in assets and a financial vocabulary most adults lacked. It was never about the amount. It was about what the amount represented: discipline, care, vision. The $1,000 principle reveals that building generational wealth doesn't begin with millions, it begins with moments. A single decision, multiplied over time, changes the story. What appears ordinary, even forgettable, becomes the foundation of a legacy. Not because it dazzles, but because it endures. Chapter 3: The Inheritance Illusion. In 1997, the owner of a prosperous construction company in Illinois passed away, leaving behind an estate worth just over $5 million. He had spent a lifetime building his business from a single pickup truck and a handful of tools. His 3 adult children, none of whom had ever worked in the company, inherited everything. Within 5 years, the business was bankrupt, the estate depleted, and the family fractured. It wasn't an isolated story. Across cultures, countries, and tax brackets, a recurring pattern emerges: the decline of wealth in subsequent generations. Economists have a term for it: shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The first generation builds, the second maintains, and the third squanders. The assumption is that inheritance acts as a safety net, a permanent upward elevator. But the evidence tells a different story. In most families, wealth is not preserved, it is consumed. This is the inheritance illusion, the belief that passing down money guarantees a better future. It doesn't. In fact, in many cases, it accelerates decline. What creates this illusion is the assumption that assets carry wisdom. They do not. A trust fund cannot teach judgment. A property deed cannot model delayed gratification. And a balance sheet, no matter how impressive, cannot replace the lived experience of building wealth from the ground up. In 2012, a longitudinal study of affluent families found that financial literacy in heirs had a stronger correlation with long-term wealth preservation than the size of the inheritance itself. Those who understood how to manage and multiply capital were more likely to preserve it. Those who didn't, lost it, regardless of how much they received. But the issue goes deeper than skills. It touches identity. In families where wealth was earned, stories were formed. There was context: the sleepless nights, the tough calls, the near bankruptcies. These experiences shaped behavior and bred caution. For those who inherited without context, money arrived as an abstraction, something to be spent, not something to be respected. This abstraction leads to what psychologists call affluenza, a disconnection from the value of money and the consequences of misuse. It's not greed. It's drift. Without a framework, financial decision-making becomes reactive instead of strategic. Cars replace investments. Lifestyle expands while income stays fixed. The inheritance, once seen as permanent, becomes fluid until it evaporates. Consider the story of the Martinez family in Southern California. The patriarch built a lucrative landscaping business, grew it for 40 years, and sold it for $3.2 million. He divided the proceeds evenly among his 4 children. Within a decade, 2 had declared bankruptcy, 1 was in the midst of a divorce triggered by financial strain, and only 1 had invested the funds into a modest rental property portfolio. The difference? The last sibling had been involved in the family business from age 16. He had witnessed payroll stress. He had walked job sites at dawn. The money wasn't a gift, it was a continuation. That subtle difference, the difference between receiving wealth and inheriting responsibility, is what determines whether a legacy survives. Truly generational wealth requires more than legal structures, it requires cultural ones. Families that succeed across generations often adopt rituals, shared language, and intentional teaching. They build inheritance systems, plans that go beyond transferring assets and instead focus on transferring beliefs, expectations, and accountability. One such family, the Nguyen's of Houston, established a generational board at the dinner table every month. From age 12, each child was given a mock budget, asked to track imaginary investments, and present decisions to the family. It was a game, until it wasn't. By the time the oldest turned 25, the family had built a real trust, and a real board to govern it. The illusion of inheritance lies in thinking that wealth alone can sustain itself. The reality is more demanding. It calls not for a one-time act of giving, but for the lifelong act of preparing. Only when heirs inherit not just assets, but understanding, can a family truly pass down more than money. They pass down momentum. Chapter 4: The Wealth Habit. In the hills of Asheville, North Carolina, a family of 5 begins every Saturday morning the same way. Before breakfast, they gather around the kitchen table, not to talk about chores or weekend plans, but to review a handwritten ledger. Each family member, including the 2 teenagers, shares their expenses from the week, how much they saved, and one financial goal for the next 7 days. It is a quiet ritual, neither dramatic nor demanding. But its impact is profound. The family, the Carsons, have never earned more than 6 figures between them. Yet over the past 20 years, they have purchased 2 homes, paid for 3 college educations, and are now preparing to fund a family-run real estate venture. There is no secret trust fund. No unexpected inheritance. Just habit, repeated, refined, and shared. The tendency is to attribute financial success to singular events, a good investment, a high-paying job, a business breakthrough. But those moments, while valuable, are not the foundation of long-term wealth. Patterns are. And among those patterns, habit stands as the most consistent and overlooked force. In 2006, a behavioral economics study revealed a surprising insight. Individuals who saved a small, fixed amount automatically every month, even as little as $50, were significantly more likely to build long-term net worth than those who saved irregularly, even in larger sums. The difference wasn't the amount, it was the automation. The habit had become part of the identity. The logic is almost deceptively simple. Wealth, over time, is the result of repeated choices. The decision to bring lunch instead of dine out. The practice of tracking expenses. The habit of reading 1 article per week about investing. Each choice, in isolation, appears trivial. But accumulated, they form a trajectory. This idea becomes even more powerful when applied to families. In the case of the Carsons, their weekly financial meeting began when the children were in elementary school. At first, it was symbolic. Toy budgets, pretend savings, simple charts. But over time, those playful exercises became embedded behaviors. By age 16, each child had a part-time job and a Roth IRA. Not because they were told to, but because they had come to expect that behavior from themselves. The contrast is stark when placed against households where money is never discussed. Silence, in this context, breeds uncertainty. Children grow up with a fragmented understanding of finances, often internalizing guilt, fear, or shame around money. When they reach adulthood, they repeat the same unspoken rules, avoiding conversations, overspending to compensate, or deferring responsibility. In a suburban neighborhood outside Chicago, a different story unfolded. The Wallace family, owners of a successful plumbing company, earned well into the top 5% of income earners. But their household had no financial routines. Bills were paid when due, but no one discussed strategy or planning. Their eldest son, upon inheriting the business, defaulted on several vendor accounts within 2 years. The company folded within 5. It wasn't a lack of capital, it was a lack of cadence. The difference between wealth built and wealth lost often comes down to structure. Habits provide that structure. They transform intention into rhythm. And rhythm, over time, becomes culture. In families that sustain wealth across generations, one common trait emerges: ritualized behavior around money. Whether it's quarterly reviews, shared reading assignments, monthly charity decisions, or automated savings plans, the repetition creates fluency. Fluency breeds confidence. And confidence leads to resilience. No fortune can be maintained without stewardship. And stewardship is not a personality trait, it is a practice behavior. One small act, done consistently, outperforms grand gestures done sporadically. The Carsons never sought to become wealthy. They simply made wealth a habit. That, in the end, may be the most powerful financial decision any family can make. Chapter 5: The First Million Myth. In 1983, A young man from Long Island named Derek Bell made headlines when he became one of the highest-paid rookies in professional baseball. With a signing bonus exceeding $500,000 and endorsements quickly following, it seemed inevitable that he would be a millionaire before his 21st birthday. By age 25, he had earned more than most families would see in a lifetime. By 30, it was gone. Not spent. Dispersed. Luxury cars, investment schemes, poorly managed partnerships, and what financial advisors often refer to as lifestyle inflation. His case was not unique. In fact, it was eerily common. A 2009 report from Sports Illustrated estimated that 78% of former NFL players face serious financial stress within 2 years of retirement. Among NBA players, the number was estimated at 60% within 5 years. The pattern is almost always the same: the first million arrives. It is celebrated. And then, silently, it begins to vanish. This is the paradox at the heart of the first million myth. The belief that wealth begins with the achievement of a specific number. $1 million. A figure that, for generations, has represented financial independence, security, and success. Yet, for most, that milestone does not signify the beginning of wealth, but its peak. What follows is often stagnation, if not decline. Why? Because the pursuit of wealth is not the same as the management of it. The behaviors that generate financial breakthroughs, risk-taking, rapid growth, and a relentless drive, are rarely the same ones that sustain financial stability across a lifetime. In fact, they often conflict. To illustrate this, consider two entrepreneurs in Austin, Texas. Both launched tech startups in the early 2010s. Both hit the $1 million mark in under 3 years. One used the capital to fund lavish office renovations, hire aggressively, and expand to 4 cities. The other reinvested modestly, built a cash reserve, and adopted a 3-year hiring freeze. Within 5 years, the first company was acquired in a fire sale, its founder walking away with little more than a lesson. The second became one of the most stable mid-sized firms in the region. The distinction lay not in brilliance or timing, but in the decision-making after the first million was made. Psychologists describe this phenomenon as a threshold illusion. People often assume that crossing a symbolic line, be it a salary, a savings goal, or a net worth, changes the underlying reality. It doesn't. It changes perception, not behavior. A person who spends recklessly before hitting 7 figures is unlikely to become cautious after. The habits remain. The mindset persists. Moreover, the myth encourages passivity. Once the milestone is achieved, there is a temptation to pause, to assume the heavy lifting is over. But money is not static. It is fluid. It responds to inflation, opportunity cost, taxation, and market volatility. 1 million today does not buy what it did in 1990. And it won't buy what it does today in 2040. What truly builds and protects wealth is not a milestone, but a model. In Pittsburgh, a middle-class family adopted a generational model built not around income, but behavior. They set percentage-based savings goals for every dollar earned, regardless of the amount. When their small business unexpectedly went viral, generating millions in revenue, their spending habits didn't change, because their systems didn't change. They continued to live on the same percentages. The wealth expanded, but the model stayed intact. The first million myth suggests that wealth is a moment. But wealth is not a moment. It is a mechanism. It is not a destination, but a direction. Sustainable wealth, generational wealth, is not measured by what is achieved, but by what is repeated. The $1 million moment, while seductive, is only valuable if it is followed by discipline, strategy, and clarity. Without those, it is not a foundation, it is a mirage. Chapter 6: Trust the Trust. In 2011, the Henderson siblings walked into a probate court in rural Pennsylvania expecting a routine process. Their father, a retired engineer, had passed away 6 weeks earlier. He had owned a modest property portfolio, a classic car collection, and a successful local hardware store. His children believed the estate would be evenly distributed, just as he had always implied. It wasn't. A hastily drafted will, written years prior and never updated, left vague instructions. Several properties had no clear title designations. 2 business accounts were in his personal name. There were no trusts. Within months, the siblings were fighting. Legal fees mounted. What could have been a straightforward transfer became a drawn-out legal brawl. The estate, once valued at $2.8 million, lost nearly a third to court costs, taxes, and conflict. This is the silent peril of unstructured wealth. The majority of families spend decades building their assets, homes, businesses, retirement accounts, but devote little time to building the frameworks that protect them. The result is often a generational fracture. According to the Wealth Council, over 55% of Americans do not have an estate plan in place. Among those who do, most plans are outdated, incomplete, or misunderstood by their heirs. This oversight is not just logistical, it's psychological. There is a discomfort around mortality, a cultural reluctance to confront what happens after. Many avoid discussing estate planning with their families, fearing conflict, discomfort, or appearing greedy. In doing so, they leave behind more than assets, they leave ambiguity. And ambiguity, in matters of inheritance, breeds tension. The trust is an answer to that ambiguity, not just a legal tool, but a philosophical one. At its core, a trust is a declaration that wealth is not merely to be possessed, but to be stewarded. It is a framework for continuity. A well-structured trust outlines not only who receives what, but under what conditions, for what purpose, and in what time frame. It transforms money into mission. In California, the Roshan family built a small chain of medical clinics. Over time, it grew into a thriving enterprise. Rather than divide the business equally among their 3 children, the parents created a living trust. The trust didn't just allocate ownership, it detailed governance. One child, trained in medicine, would lead clinical operations. Another, with a finance degree, would oversee budgeting. The third, an artist, would receive a share of profits but hold no decision-making power. There was no resentment, because there was clarity. More importantly, the trust included a clause requiring each beneficiary to attend an annual family financial summit. The result was not just order, but alignment. The family understood the purpose of the business and their role in preserving it. Contrast this with the outcome of Singer Prince's estate. When he died in 2016 without a will or trust, a battle over his multi-million-dollar fortune erupted. Over 45 people claimed to be heirs. Legal proceedings dragged on for 6 years. The estate, initially valued at over $200 million, lost tens of millions to fees and mismanagement. The tragedy was not just financial, it was reputational. A legacy shaped by creativity and control became one defined by chaos. The most effective wealth builders understand a crucial truth: accumulation is only half the equation. Preservation is the other. And preservation demands structure. Trusts are not just for the ultra-wealthy. They can protect modest estates from probate, reduce tax burdens, and ensure heirs receive assets in ways that reflect the original intent. But beyond the technical benefits, they offer something far rarer: relational clarity. A trust forces difficult conversations early. It replaces speculation with structure. It turns intentions into instructions. Wealth that is inherited without a framework becomes vulnerable. Wealth that is passed through a trust gains resilience. In the end, a trust is not about control, it is about continuity. It is not a cage, but a corridor. A well-built trust does not restrict a legacy. It extends it. Chapter 7: The Cultural Contract. In a small neighborhood in Queens, New York, every Sunday after church, the Nguyen family would sit together at the dining room table, not for lunch, but for legacy. With ages ranging from 8 to 80, they discussed family finances, reviewed shared goals, and told stories of how their grandparents arrived in America with $40 and a suitcase of hope. No spreadsheets. No lectures. Just conversation. Decades later, when the patriarch passed away, the transition of the family's real estate holdings, businesses, and assets occurred without dispute. The grandchildren, now adults, managed the family's portfolio collectively. Their decisions were swift, unified, and remarkably efficient. This was not a story about wealth. It was a story about culture. The idea that financial success depends solely on money management skills is incomplete. What actually shapes generational wealth is a shared understanding, a contract not written in ink but embedded in rituals, language, and values. Sociologists call this a cultural contract, a framework that passes down not just assets, but the logic for managing them. This contract is not signed. It is absorbed. In immigrant communities, this unspoken system often emerges by necessity. Take the case of the Arroyos, a Dominican-American family in Miami. 3 generations lived under one roof. The parents worked long hours and pooled earnings to pay off a small home. Children were expected to contribute from part-time jobs. Every financial decision, whether to buy a new car, take a vacation, or fund college, was made communally. That habit didn't disappear when the children grew up. Instead, it became a feature of their adulthood. Today, the Arroyo's siblings jointly own 6 rental properties and meet monthly to evaluate performance. What they inherited wasn't just money. It was method. By contrast, families without this internal contract tend to treat wealth as isolated. Conversations about money are rare or awkward. Values are assumed, not expressed. Decisions are made individually rather than collectively. Over time, this leads to fragmentation, not just of wealth, but of vision. Research conducted by the Williams Group analyzed over 3,000 families and found that 60% of wealth transfers fail, not due to poor financial advice, but because of a breakdown in communication and trust. The data was clear: families that never discussed wealth were far more likely to lose it. One case involved the Wexler family, founders of a successful restaurant chain in the Midwest. When the founder died, he left behind a significant inheritance for his 2 children. There had never been a family discussion about the business, its future, or the expectations tied to the money. One sibling wanted to sell. The other wanted to expand. Litigation followed. The business folded within 3 years. The cultural contract, once broken, is difficult to repair. But in families that sustain wealth, certain patterns emerge. They prioritize storytelling, oral histories about sacrifice, mistakes, and principles. They ritualize decision-making, holding family councils, financial retreats, or shared planning sessions. And they use symbols, objects, traditions, or mottos to remind the next generation that their wealth is not just personal but collective. In Nairobi, Kenya, a multi-generational family used a carved wooden box to collect handwritten notes of gratitude and lessons learned each year. At the end of December, the box was opened during a large family dinner. Alongside laughter and stories, these letters served as reminders of shared responsibility. That family now runs a foundation supporting education in rural communities, funded entirely by their pooled investments. The cultural contract is not limited by geography or income. It transcends both. It is a decision to frame wealth not as a transaction, but as a tradition. And like all contracts, it requires renewal. Families who thrive across generations revisit this contract often. They evolve it. They teach it. They live it. Because when values are passed down with the same urgency as assets, something remarkable happens. Wealth no longer divides. It binds. Chapter 8: The Anti-Hustle Revelation. In the heart of Houston's startup scene, a young software developer named Terrence Rivera was celebrated as a rising star. Known for working 80-hour weeks and sleeping on the office couch, he fit the image that culture often worships: the tireless grinder. Investors loved his drive. Colleagues admired his intensity. But 4 years later, the company shuttered, the product failed, and Rivera was burned out, emotionally, physically, and financially. His story wasn't an outlier. It was a pattern. For decades, the narrative around success, particularly financial success, has been dominated by the hustle ethic. Sacrifice sleep. Maximize hours. Outwork everyone. The belief is simple: the more one does, the more one earns. But what if the core premise is wrong? A growing body of evidence suggests it is. In 2018, Researchers at Stanford University published findings showing that productivity sharply declines after 50 hours of work per week. Beyond 55 hours, it becomes negligible. Not just inefficient, counterproductive. Meanwhile, data from self-made millionaires revealed a surprising trend. The majority did not achieve wealth through relentless effort alone, but by building systems that functioned independently of their time. This shift in thinking, what might be called the anti-hustle revelation, presents a different framework for building generational wealth. It argues that real prosperity is not earned through exhaustion, but through leverage. Consider the case of Danielle Wright, a former marketing executive who left her job after realizing she had become a high-income earner with low time autonomy. She transitioned into real estate investing, purchasing duplexes in mid-sized cities with strong rental demand. She automated management through third-party services and reinvested cash flow into additional properties. By year 5, she had built a self-sustaining portfolio. She worked less than 20 hours per week. Her income exceeded what she had once earned working full-time. Danielle didn't hustle harder. She hustled smarter. Leverage is the hidden engine behind many enduring fortunes. It appears in different forms: financial investing capital, operational delegating tasks, and intellectual licensing knowledge or content. The common thread is that effort is multiplied, not added. Families who pass on wealth across generations often embrace this principle. Instead of encouraging children to work harder, they teach them to identify systems. A vending machine route. A royalty-generating product. A digital course. A dividend stock portfolio. These assets generate income without requiring more hours. They create freedom, not fatigue. In contrast, the hustle mindset often leads to fragile success. The business owner who insists on doing everything eventually burns out or bottlenecks growth. The professional who equates long hours with value may find themselves trapped in a cycle where wealth can only grow as fast as their energy allows. The anti-hustle revelation reframes wealth as an architecture, not an achievement. It's not about climbing ladders, it's about building machines. In Atlanta, a family bakery passed down through 3 generations thrived not because each new leader worked longer hours, but because each one added layers of automation and scalability. The grandfather baked every loaf by hand. His daughter introduced batch processing and regional delivery. Her son developed an e-commerce platform and outsourced logistics. The business grew exponentially, but the workload didn't. The culture at large continues to celebrate overwork. Rise and grind. Slogans are painted on office walls. Social media glorifies 4 a.m. routines. But quietly, in the margins, another philosophy is emerging. It whispers what the loudest voices often ignore: that rest can be strategic, that time is capital, and that wealth isn't measured in hours worked, it's measured in hours owned. Generational wealth favors systems over sprints. The anti-hustle revelation is not an invitation to avoid effort, it is a challenge to redefine it. Because true financial freedom doesn't come from doing more. It comes from needing less, and building structures that work while the creator sleeps. Chapter 9: Money is a Story. In 1989, in a small town outside of Cleveland, 2 brothers inherited identical amounts of money from their grandmother, $25,000 each. Raised under the same roof, attending the same public school, and working the same after-school job, their lives seemed indistinguishable in every meaningful way. Yet within 10 years, one brother had parlayed his inheritance into a thriving landscaping business and a paid-off house. The other had declared bankruptcy. The difference wasn't education. It wasn't discipline. It wasn't luck. It was narrative. The first brother saw money as a tool, a form of freedom that needed to be directed with purpose. The second viewed it as a fleeting opportunity, best spent before it disappeared. One treated money as something to grow. The other treated it as something to escape with. The numbers in their bank accounts were the same. The stories they told themselves were not. This is the silent engine behind generational wealth: narrative. Money doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is shaped by the stories families tell about it, stories that begin in childhood and echo into adulthood. And just like stories passed down through folklore or family tradition, financial narratives have the power to define identity, behavior, and legacy. A 2013 study by Emory University found that children who knew more about their family history, including stories of both success and struggle, showed higher levels of emotional resilience and self-confidence. The same principle applies to financial literacy. When wealth is placed in context, when it is tied to a story, it becomes more than currency. It becomes culture. Consider the case of the Ito family in Sacramento. Every Thanksgiving, before the meal, the eldest living member tells the story of how the family nearly lost their dry cleaning business during a recession in the 1970s. That story ends not with financial success, but with a hard lesson about unity, sacrifice, and planning. For the younger generation, it functions as a cautionary tale, but also as a compass. By contrast, many families avoid financial storytelling altogether. They keep money shrouded in secrecy. Children grow up hearing mixed messages. Money doesn't grow on trees, we can't afford that, or don't talk about finances. Without a coherent narrative, they develop their own, and often, that story is built on fear, scarcity, or shame. In these environments, money becomes emotionally loaded. Wealth becomes something to hide. Spending becomes a means of validation. Investing becomes a foreign language. And generational wealth, no matter how well constructed, collapses under the weight of misinterpretation. But the power of story works in both directions. Narratives can destroy, but they can also transform. In Minneapolis, a single mother named Cherise Williams began writing short letters to her children when they turned 10. Each letter shared one financial principle and a personal story. One was about her first credit card. Another detailed the embarrassment of borrowing money from a relative. The letters weren't perfect. They weren't even planned. But over time, they formed a written legacy, one that helped her children avoid many of the pitfalls she had once stumbled into. When her eldest graduated college, he framed 3 of the letters and hung them in his dorm. They weren't just memories. They were maps. Stories give structure to chaos. They take abstract ideas and turn them into lived experiences. In families that pass on wealth successfully, the most valuable inheritance is often invisible. It's the language they use around budgeting, the metaphors they employ about saving, the heroes and villains they assign to financial decisions. Wealth without story is unstable. It can be inherited, but not understood. Spent, but not sustained. But when money becomes a story, a shared, evolving narrative, it stops being a number and starts being a legacy. Chapter 10: Crisis-Proofing the Legacy. In the spring of 2008, a sudden financial collapse shook the global economy. Banks failed, markets plummeted, and families across the country watched as decades of savings vanished in weeks. But in a quiet corner of Wisconsin, the Patel family weathered the storm with almost eerie calm. Their family business, an equipment rental company, took a hit, but never folded. Their investments dipped, but they didn't panic. The reason was not luck. It was preparation. Years earlier, the family had built what they called a shock plan, a set of emergency protocols that outlined what to do during a recession, a health crisis, a leadership transition, or even a death. It was detailed, boring, and often ignored by outsiders. But when the moment came, the system clicked into place. The Patels had crisis-proofed their legacy. Wealth, at its core, is fragile. It is built slowly and undone quickly. Natural disasters, lawsuits, economic downturns, and illness can unravel years of progress in months. Yet most families spend far more time planning how to grow their wealth than how to protect it. This asymmetry, between building and shielding, often proves costly. In Los Angeles, a boutique clothing brand, passed down from father to daughter, had been thriving for over 2 decades. But when a fire broke out in their primary warehouse, everything halted. Inventory, equipment, and archives were lost. There was no insurance coverage for the specific type of damage, no backup system, and no disaster recovery plan. The business closed in 6 months. By contrast, a small furniture-making operation in North Carolina survived a similar fire, thanks to redundant off-site storage, a pre-negotiated insurance policy, and a 6-month operating reserve. Their revenue dropped, but not their confidence. The difference wasn't resources. It was resilience. Resilience, in the context of generational wealth, doesn't mean resistance to crisis, it means readiness for it. Families that endure tend to operate from a defensive posture as much as a growth mindset. They build contingency plans. They diversify income streams. They treat what if not as a fear, but as a question worth answering. Consider the Al-Karim family in Toronto. As first-generation immigrants, their path to financial stability was marked by scarcity and sacrifice. When their small chain of halal grocery stores began turning a profit, they didn't celebrate by expanding. Instead, they created a private family fund, accessible only in the event of death, legal threat, or business disruption. It sat untouched for over 15 years. Then came the pandemic. While competitors scrambled for rent relief and supply chain access, the Al-Karims dipped into the fund, kept employees on payroll, and reopened with almost no debt. The lesson was clear: wealth is not tested in its creation, but in its preservation. Experts in risk management often emphasize the concept of stress testing, a way of simulating disasters to identify weak points. Pilots train for engine failure. Athletes prepare for injury. But in personal finance, such foresight is rare. Few families imagine themselves losing a job, getting sued, or facing a health crisis. Fewer still document what to do when it happens. And yet, the families that do survive. In many cases, the tools for crisis proofing are straightforward. Life insurance. Legal structures like LLCs or irrevocable trusts. Emergency savings accounts. Regular audits. Estate plans that get updated, not just drafted. These tools are not dramatic. But when crisis strikes, they become decisive. More importantly, they create confidence across generations. When the next generation knows a plan exists, they're less likely to act from fear. They inherit not only wealth, but stability. No fortune is permanent without foresight. And no legacy survives by accident. Crisis proofing isn't about expecting disaster. It's about refusing to be undone by it. Because in the long arc of a family's story, it's not just the booms that shape the legacy, it's how the busts are handled. Chapter 11: The 100-Year Family. In the spring of 1924, a German immigrant named Ernst Albrecht arrived in Kansas with little more than a carpenter's apron and a notebook filled with sketches of furniture he hoped to one day build. Over the next 40 years, he turned those drawings into a thriving business, one that supported his children, employed dozens in his town, and left behind a comfortable estate. But the true legacy wasn't measured in profits. In a weathered leather binder, now held by his great-granddaughter, Ernst had written a single line that guided the next 3 generations. "This is not for me. This is for those who come after." That sentence, though simple, embodies what researchers and wealth strategists now refer to as the 100-year family, a family that sees wealth not as a reward, but as a relay. Not as personal gain, but as generational stewardship. Across cultures and centuries, families that retain influence, assets, and cohesion over multiple generations share a single trait: long-term thinking. Their goals stretch far beyond one person's lifetime. Their decisions are shaped by what will matter not in 5 years, but in 50. A 2004 study from Cambridge Family Enterprise Group found that fewer than 10% of family-owned businesses survived past the 3rd generation. The reason? Short-term focus. Many families build wealth with urgency but fail to extend that timeline to legacy. Structures dissolve. Vision narrows. Momentum fades. The families that break this cycle do something profoundly countercultural. They think in centuries. Take the Ferraro family of northern Italy. In 1902, the family launched a small vineyard. Every generation since has added a new layer, not just in land or production, but in governance. A family council was created in the 1940s. A shared education fund followed in the 70s. In the 1990s, they formed a values charter, reaffirming their shared principles on generosity, work ethic, and stewardship. As of 2023, 23 family members hold roles across the enterprise. None of them believe the company belongs to them. They believe they belong to it. This shift is subtle but powerful. In short-term families, wealth is consumed. In 100-year families, wealth is cultivated. What sets these families apart isn't wealth alone. It's clarity. Clarity of mission. Clarity of identity. Clarity of expectations. They do not rely on the presence of a founder to guide them. Instead, they institutionalize their values through documents, rituals, and governance systems. In Boston, the Morgan Riley family conducts an annual Future Day. It's not a holiday. It's a planning session where 3 generations review assets, assess risks, and propose initiatives for impact. Children as young as 10 are invited to observe. The purpose is not financial transparency alone, but cultural continuity. The family doesn't just want to preserve money, they want to preserve meaning. Compare that to families where no systems exist, where wealth is transferred without narrative, structure, or expectations. The next generation often feels burdened, not empowered. Money becomes a source of conflict rather than cohesion. The 100-year family understands that every asset needs an architecture. And every legacy needs leadership, not of authority, but of vision. They create tools, family constitutions, generational trusts, mentorship between elders and successors, education programs tailored to wealth literacy, annual gatherings centered around mission, not money. And above all, they create stories. Stories that explain why the family exists, what it values, and who it is becoming. The challenge is not just to build something that lasts. The challenge is to build something that lasts on purpose. The 100-year family is not a fantasy. It is a framework. It requires intention, patience, and design. But the reward is extraordinary, not just in wealth retained, but in identity forged. Because in the end, the most powerful inheritance is not dollars. It is direction. Take care and be well.